I'm excited to see so many of you and talk about something that I'm super passionate about, something that I do a lot of research on, and that is the role of social media in elections and politics. And when we think about this phenomenon, I mean, it's a big question to talk about in 15 minutes, right? So what we tend to do as political communication scientists is we break it down into bits that we can manage, right? And the first is information. How do we get information from social media, and how does the way that we consume political news affect how we vote, how we participate in politics? The second is communication, and this has to do with how we talk with one another, our friends, our family, maybe strangers we meet on the internet about politics. And the third is participation. How does social media change the ways that we participate in democracy? And these three things are interlinked, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about what's going on the cutting edge of research in each of these three fields. Okay, the first thing is sort of set the stage. What actually can we do on social media? How can we generate content? And the first is by simply posting, right? Posting a status, posting a picture. It could be a news article. It could be an opinion we have about politics. That's one thing. There's another way, which is commenting, right? We can react to news through commenting, but we can also do less intensive forms of engagement, such as simply liking and maybe putting an angry emoji to things we see that we don't like. And then the last one, this is my favorite, these are the lurkers. These are people who actually don't engage in posting, but they're still there, and they're still reading content as it comes on social media. And all of these forms of engagement, all of these activities create a massive amount of data. I mean, so much data, our human brains aren't able to cope. We don't know how to deal with it. So when we're trying to study this, we have to break it down, as I said before. So looking at first, information. How does social media change the ways that we consume news? And why is this important? Well, there's a lot of reasons why it's important, but the first, I think the most important, is that we know from decades of political science research that those who know more about politics are more likely to vote. So political knowledge increases voting, and people get informed through the media. The media is the primary way that we get information about politics. And it's important to remember that while social media are a revolutionary type of technology, they're not the first time that we've had a media revolution, right? The newspaper, radio, television, the internet, these have all massively changed the ways that we consume news and how we understand ourselves and our national community. And social media it's revolutionary, but it's just the latest chain in that, the latest step in that evolutionary chain. Okay, social media and news consumption. We know, you probably know, that people are increasingly getting news from social media, right? Duh, we sort of know that. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that social media is more than just one platform. We have to think about the differences across social media, and where the cutting edge of research is right now is the situation looks like this. Oh, my emojis aren't working, that's terrible. Anyway, so this would be an emoji. And people are getting news from all different types of platforms all during the course of the day. So you're getting some news from Facebook, you're getting some news from Instagram, maybe one of your friends shares something on WhatsApp. And so while you're getting all these different types of news, we call this in the field multi-platform news use. And this is where things start to get interesting, because scholars like to think about it as snacking. So media snacking, like you're snacking on chips or ROM bars, and you're just snacking. You're getting a little bit of news from Facebook, you're getting a little bit of news from YouTube. And one of the questions that we scientists are trying to understand is, what's the effect of all this snacking? What happens when you're snacking all this news all the time? We know that this type of media snacking, or this multi-platform news use, is the highest in younger people, right? Younger generations tend to consume news through social media, and sometimes almost exclusively through social media. And what the research tends to show is that this type of media snacking, it increases people's likelihood to go out and protest or to boycott a certain product, for environmental sustainability reasons. It increases people's likelihood to volunteer, but it decreases people's likelihood to vote. And that's bad for democracy. That one worked, great. Because if you look at turnout in the European Parliament elections, for example, it's on the decline. It's been declining almost every election. And from a political science perspective, I can tell you that if voter turnout is low in an election, that's precisely when you should vote, because your vote has more power than if everyone shows up. So that's just a quick plug to vote in the European Parliament elections. So going back to this idea of media snacking, and you're getting all this news from different sources, there's a really interesting theory, and it's called the news finds me perception. And the idea is that news will simply just find you. So there are people, I think all of us have some amount of this perception in us, that instead of going out and actively looking for news, actively reading newspapers, we think important news will simply find us through social media, through our friends, but increasingly through social media. So it's kind of like this apple hitting you on the head. If something important happens, it'll just find you. And the idea is that social media are these kind of apples falling on our heads, where if something's important, it's just gonna find us. So why should we go and read the newspaper or watch the news on TV? People who have this perception, so it's been measured through surveys, people who have the news finds me perception, who think about this, they tend to have less political knowledge. And what's interesting about this is they think they know a lot about politics because news is finding them. So they think they're very informed, but survey research shows they actually have low political knowledge. So people who have this idea that the news will find them have a lower amount of political knowledge, which in turn decreases voting. And again, not a good thing for democracy. So these are the types of questions that we're trying to figure out as scientists. What is the effect of social media news use? Grabbing a little bit of news everywhere, every day? Your political knowledge decreases, and you're less likelihood to vote, which is not good if you believe in rule by the people. This tends to be, at least in the US, where most of this research is being done, but it's starting to be done in other countries, this tends to be, this news finds me perception, something that is high in youth, women, and people who have lower income than average. But it's also being detected in Spain, in Ukraine, all over the world. So this is something that appears to be happening in the world. Okay, we can't really talk too much about information without talking about disinformation. I'm not going to go too much into it. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But there's some really interesting research that shows, do you know who shares fake news? Old people, people over 65. And you know, that is a super interesting finding, because when all of this Russian disinformation stuff was happening, everyone was worried about the youth, right? The younger people. They're being manipulated by Russian bots. But I think it's actually the opposite that's happening, where young people who grow up with social media and the internet, they can sniff out fake news. They kind of know when something's not right, when they've been playing pranks on each other, they've been growing up and stuff. But it's the older people who are most susceptible to fake news. And they're the ones that are more likely to share it. And that's something interesting. We need to think about media literacy, not just for youth, but also for the elderly as well. Okay, so that was my bit on information. Now I'm going to move into communication. So how do we discuss politics with one another through social media? Looking at citizens, how citizens discuss politics, when we look at public spaces like public Facebook pages and Twitter, because as scientists, we can't go into people's personal networks and see what they do. So a lot of the research that we're focusing on are like public pages, media, politicians, who's commenting on that stuff. And what it turns out is that most of the comments that you'll see on media pages are generated by a really small number of users. And those users tend to be extreme in their ideologies, and they also tend to promote nationalism. This is something that's across platforms, across different countries. We repeatedly see this type of phenomenon. So this is some data from a study I've been working on looking at the Brexit referendum, where we look at the comments for the three campaigns. There was Vote Leave, Stay, Remain, and there was another Vote Leave campaign that was unofficial, but it was very anti-immigration, very nationalist. And you'll see on the left, you have the number of users, the number of people who commented, and on the right, the number of comments. So what you see is basically a small number of users and a lot of comments. If one person commented on every post, it would be equal. And these small number of users are just super extreme. They tend to promote nationalism, as I said, and we'll see that the radical, or the most radical, Leave campaign from the Brexit referendum, you'll see how much activity was on that page compared to the others. So it's just an interesting finding that we keep seeing. But citizens aren't the only ones who use social media to communicate. Politicians do as well. And what's interesting, what's different, is that they're using so much data in order to target people with paid advertising, right? I'm sure you've seen some political ads in your news feeds, and there was no way for us to see what was going on. What was happening was you had troll farms in Russia or shadow organizations that were investing a lot of money in trying to influence elections through Facebook, Instagram, even Pinterest. I mean, really, any social media platform has had these problems. And of course, you probably heard that Facebook, Twitter, and Google had to go to the US Congress and sort of explain themselves. And here you'll see a US senator clearly not happy with what's going on. So what did Facebook do? They created this public archive. It's called the Facebook Ad Library. Any of you can go and check it out. And you can basically search for what ads are running on which pages, in different countries. And it's a pretty cool tool. If you just Google it, you can go and play around in there yourself. It's not the best system, but it gives us an idea of what political actors are doing. So I just put in the European Parliament a few days ago to see what they're doing. And this is what it looks like if you click on one of the ads. So this is a video that has to do with voting for Portuguese in the European Parliament elections. You can see how much money was spent on the ad, so between $1,000 and $5,000, kind of a lot. You can see how many people probably saw the ad, between 50 and 100,000. You can see what age ranges were targeted. It's a bit hard to see, but this is younger, and this goes older. So clearly not targeting over 65s. They're probably sharing all that fake news. But you can also see between men and women. So it looks like this ad was targeted towards younger females, and then you can see where they were placed. I don't know why the US is on this map. Usually it has different countries, but that was the case. So I want to show you how institutions and politicians are using paid advertising. They're doing what's called A/B testing. Some of you may have heard of that. And you can kind of see what they're doing if you go into this ad archive. So you'll see the European Parliament here is running pretty much the same ad, but all they're changing is really, really small things. A down arrow, an up arrow, the European flag. There's a little bit of a difference here. And what they do is they put a small amount of these ads out with these very small changes. And then they try to see which ones get the most likes, the most comments, the most shares. And they take that one, and then they go ahead and boost that and try to target people on that. So this is something new we haven't seen in politics before, this sort of testing of different advertisements to see what works with the electorate. Okay, so that was communication. Participation. How is social media changing the way that we engage in politics and democracy? And there's a lot of ways, but I want to focus on one that's particularly important, and it's this idea of connective action. And what that is a theory that's been happening all over the world, which is people use social media and internet technologies in order to come together, usually to protest, very, very quickly. So we've seen this in the Arab Spring. We've seen this in the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine. We've also seen it here in Romania in anti-corruption protests. And here you see hundreds of thousands of people gathering in Bucharest to protest. They have their phones in the air, which is kind of symbolic, right? It's interesting because you could probably have this protest in the 1970s and the 1980s, but it wouldn't take place as quickly, and it wouldn't take place as often. So we also have it going on in the Yellow Vest protest in France, where Facebook is key to help protesters organize every single weekend. And this type of quick action by citizens, we haven't seen that scale or that speed before. And this is one of the ways that social media is really changing citizens and their voice from the bottom up. So, I think my clicker died here. Can we go to the next slide? There we go. Okay, so politicians are using this organizing potential of citizens through apps. And this is something really interesting that's going on. I don't think a lot of people are aware of it. So this is an app developed by a right-wing company in the United States that sells this app to other right-wing parties across the world. And you'll see it allows people, just in how they were organized in the streets, it allows them to organize online. So it has buttons where you can click and share an anti-EU graphic. So this is from the Brexit campaign, Vote Leave. You can tap this button through the app and automatically share through Facebook anti-European messages. And by doing so, you get 25 action points. And with your action points, you can build up and you can level up. So it has this gamification engine built into the app. So you go from a cadet to a lieutenant to a captain by taking more and more action. And this is a way that politicians are using technology in order to organize people virtually so they can all at the same time send a tweet, or they can all send something on the same time on Facebook. And what this does is it serves to manipulate the algorithms so that this content is promoted, it's shown to more people, and it's promoted faster. So these type of solutions are quite expensive, but even if parties don't have apps, they're using technologies like Telegram and WhatsApp groups in order to basically have the same effect, have everyone do something, post something on Facebook at the same time. So that's one of the ways that social media is changing participation. And instead of a conclusion, I would encourage you to learn more. And as was mentioned, I do a podcast called Social Media and Politics. It's free. You can download it on iTunes or Spotify. And it's basically interviews with different experts, like the person who created that app, telling us about the ways that social media is changing democracy. And episode 15 was done by a colleague of mine, and it looks at the anti-corruption protest in Romania. So I thought it might be interesting for you guys to check out. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. Please join me to take some questions from the audience. I already know that we have a lot of questions.
Okay,
we will
lightning
pick
round.
some. And now important information for them. E foarte important să știți că absolut toate întrebările pe care le-ați adresat vor intra în acel concurs de care vă spuneam, nu doar cele care vor fi selectate și la care vor răspunde vorbitorii noștri. So, let's see, let's have the first question. Not yet, still waiting.
Are there any from the audience, maybe?
We already have, now it's your presentation. Okay.
How can we manage stop the fake news phenomenon?
Yeah.
Good question. I don't think we can.
Can we? Exactly.
No, well, the solution so far is what I just showed, was this ad archive. And the real problem, as I also mentioned, is the amount of data. If you just think of that phone and all the notifications, the amount of data that's flowing through social media is incredible. And these companies, they have some automated systems to try to detect fake news, but they can't compete with the amount of people who are setting up new accounts, who are spreading fake news. So they close them down, they reappear.
Yeah.
You hit one and then two pop up. And this is something that's not easily sorted because of the size of these platforms. If you think about how many people are on Facebook, over 2 billion. How can you monitor that?
Yeah.
So there's automatic systems in place, but the problem is that when the platforms start to do something, the fake news disinformants get smarter. So it's a cat and mouse. It's sort of like cops and robbers, policemen and criminals, and it just keeps going. So there is no real easy answer for that, and I think it's something that unfortunately we just have to live with.
Yeah. There was an idea that supporting the investigative journalism will help to, I don't know, to have a good balance between fake news and real informations. What do you think about it?
I mean, of course, more journalism is good and more high quality journalism is good. But investigative journalism is slow. It takes time and it takes money.
Really?
And a lot of this cheap fake news that's being churned out is it's quick. So there's an advantage. So the platforms are trying, but the problem is that the people who are in power, whether it's the European Commission or the United States, they don't understand the technology of the platforms, in a large part because the platforms don't let them see what's going on behind the scenes. So it's a very difficult situation. But the good news is there is good news.
There is a good news. Great.
Is from the research perspective, I haven't seen a study that shows that fake news works. Even though older people are sharing fake news, we don't really know if fake news and disinformation actually changes anyone's opinion. If you think about how much do people trust the information they see on social media, almost across the world, it's about 30% of people trust the news they see on social media. So I'm personally not convinced that disinformation actually changes anyone's mind about who they're going to vote for example.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see now the next questions. Has to be done to increase the voting on European elections.
Yes.
Wow.
That's
What's
a good one.
What's to be done?
So connecting this to the theme of my talk, I think actually the European Parliament can do better in terms of targeting young voters where they are, which is on social media. So they're doing a bit of this. I showed you some advertisements that the European Parliament is running, but if they ran a get out the vote campaign like, let's say Donald Trump ran his presidential campaign, polling, getting lots of data, finding out exactly who's likely to vote and not voting, they can target them with messages that work. So I actually think advertising through the platforms can be one way to help increase voting in the European Parliament elections.
Yeah, but the very young people, they are changing the platforms. Actually, we have to follow them in the new platforms.
Exactly.
Which are those now for the really, really young voters?
For the really, really young voters, there's one called TikTok.
TikTok.
It's actually really fun.
Yeah.
Is anyone out there on TikTok? You got to download it. It's
We're not so young.
it's like a Snapchat with music videos. So it's people who do different like challenges, and then you can put music videos on top. It's hard to explain, but that's where the really young people are these days.
Snapchat, it's already old-fashioned.
Snapchat's already old-fashioned.
Oh my God.
I don't know what comes after Gen Z, to be honest. But and I've heard from some researchers that there's already disinformation going on TikTok. So these are, these disinformants are very technologically savvy.
I think it's really a challenge for you as a researcher, no? To see what is happening in the very new platforms.
It's crazy, and what doesn't help is the fact that after all this disinformation scandals, that Facebook turned off its data to researchers. And we could only see what was on public pages before. So we only had a very small slice of data to work with, and now that's gone. So we're really thinking, we've had a lot of conferences about like, how do we go forward in this post-API age where we don't have so much data to work with. So we have to start doing things like interviews and observing how people use social media. But the data wasn't great before, and there's not many people working on this compared to how important it is, I think. So it's a struggle for research for sure.
I think we have a question really for Romania. Let's see it from the beginning. Okay. How do you think social media impacted the referendum in Romania last November?
I have to say I'm not an expert in Romanian politics, unfortunately. So I might have to pass on that one. I would imagine, there's a bunch of creating awareness and news sharing, but I don't know, were there any protests around the referendum or any sort of community involvement?
Yeah, let's
skip it.
Sorry about that. Let's see the next question. In Romania, it has, let's see it here. In Romania, it has become a trend to make memes about what happens in politics. Do you think that through memes it will spark the young generation interest in politics and maybe become more active? This will be the first question.
This is a really excellent question. Memes are super interesting. There's a couple things to say about them. I think memes, they're great for going viral and for getting interest. Whoever asked that question is exactly right, because social media is becoming more image-based and visual, right? There's not so much text anymore. And there's kind of a positive and a negative of memes. On the one hand, they can increase people's interest in politics. People share them. They're usually quite funny, which helps send stuff viral on social media. But they often don't have much political substance in them. So on the one hand, they increase participation.
Yeah.
But maybe they decrease what people know about issues, and it's not the type of hardcore politics. But at the same time, it gets more people engaged. So it's an interesting plus and minus there.
They encourage the snacking.
Yeah,
you were talking about.
Exactly. So it's like serving the snacking to you. But the second part of that question is great, because they're so right in that we have to think about social media and the internet as an ecosystem, not just a single platform. So people might see a meme and then they go and Google something. And this is exactly what we see. If you remember the photo of the Syrian drowned refugee child.
Yes,
so
we all remember it.
When that went viral, Google, or some researchers looked at what was happening on Google. And you could see in different countries how that event sparked people asking, what's going on? What's the Syrian refugee crisis? How can I adopt a Syrian child? Things like that. And this is actually what politicians do as well. They'll target ads, and then they'll monitor what people search on Google to see how effective that ad was. So it is this type of ecosystem, and the really smart campaigns are using it to their advantage.
Yes. And I think one more question,
One more question.
The last one. Is democracy in danger due to social media?
I don't think social media is the most pressing problem when it comes to democracy.
But
no, I think I'm still very much a techno-optimist. So I think that social media technologies have a huge potential still for this type of connective action, for exchanging ideas, for getting feedback from the public in terms of policy proposals. But I think that there's some other larger issues, and I know you're a journalist, so I'm sorry here, but I think the way that the mainstream media has been reporting about politics over the past 40 years, this more sensationalist type of reporting is much more has much more implication for democracy than social media does. And there's also what's happening in the real world in terms of migration flows and increasing inequality. I think these are really the hardcore issues. Social media is an easy target to point a finger at, but I don't think it's bringing down democracy. No.
Okay, thank you so much. It was brilliant talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Doamnelor, domnilor, Michael Bossetta.